Hey guys, first and foremost I would like to apologize for the sincere lag in this week's video, well, this month's video. One of these semesters exam season might just kill me. In the last video I discussed Smith's chapter for the natural reasons why different people get paid different amounts. So why is it that a doctor gets paid more than a trash man, for example? If you missed that, you can click here. In this chapter, Smith talks about what he calls inequalities of policy. He says that governmental policy can often influence wages and profits in such a way that is unnatural, that go away from the natural circumstances. And he highlights 3 ways in which this can happen. The first is by restricting the number of people allowed to enter into a given trade, and therefore artificially increasing the demand of the number of people working in that trade. Although I'm going to largely focus on how this works with wages, the same applies for profits in any way that they restrict the number of commodities that enter into a market. Any way in which governments erect barriers to entry into a given field is a way in which they are artificially restricting the number of people allowed to enter into that field. But the most common way that this happens is by the government imposing mandatory licensing and/or certification. Licensing and certification often requires investment of time and or money that some people just don't have. Therefore, fewer people are entering into the market. In Smith's day, they did this through apprenticeships. In order to work as basically anything, you needed to apprentice. Smith has a big problem with the concept of forced apprenticeships, particularly prolonged forced apprenticeships. He looks at different countries around the world and sees how long their forced apprentices are and mentions that in England it's 7 years. 7 years! And he argues that this is pointless. If it takes you 7 years to learn to be a blacksmith, maybe blacksmithing isn't your thing. Smith highlights an abundance of reasons why forced apprenticeships are a bad thing, but in order to keep this video in reasonable length, I've decided to focus on the ones that are most translatable to the types of licensing that we have today. There are some types of licensing that are basically paying a government fee, which is kind of akin to extortion, really, if you think about it. But there are also lots of types of licensing that require a very specific set amount of education in order to work in a specific trade. There are lots of negative repercussions that can happen from forcing all of your tradesmen to undergo education of some kind. Not least amongst these reasons is the fact that just because they underwent a certain amount of education does not ensure in any way that they are not only competent at their jobs, but also good at them. This argument spirals into an entire discussion about the morality of forcing apprenticeships. So let's say there's a guy out there who's really talented with wires, and he can build a circuit board that is not only functional, but beautiful. But he doesn't have a license. He didn't spend the 2 years or however long it takes in order to get an electrician's license. If I want to hire that guy who could build that beautiful circuit board, I should be allowed to hire him, even though he doesn't have a license. Now, the standard argument for forcing apprenticeships or education is that it prevents fraud, but it doesn't. Smith says that word of mouth prevents fraud much better than any government stamp ever could. And this is especially true in the age of Yelp. If he does a bad job, I'm not likely to recommend him to my friends, and they are unlikely to hire him. If there is no licensing, you're a lot more likely to be a discerning consumer. Being able to be a discerning consumer is one of the rights we have in the Western world, the ability to make choices based on our own opinions, rather than what the government has to say about it. I mean, they trust us to choose who's going to be head of our nation's state, but somehow we're not allowed to choose who's going to build our house because he's not a licensed contractor. Licensing is so much a part of our culture and the way we conduct ourselves, it's very hard to imagine a world in which it doesn't exist. And it's easy to think of examples of trades that nobody would ever give up licensing for, like doctors and lawyers. An argument against which I am happy to have with anyone in the comments. Morality aside though, effectively speaking, forcing apprenticeships sets into motion a 2-step process that artificially raises wages, which is what Smith is concerned with. If acquiring a license requires an investment of time and or money, less people are going to do so, regardless of their skills in this trade. This means that less people are going to work in this trade, which means that their wages are artificially going to rise. Which brings us to the next step. Less people working in this trade means that their wages are artificially higher, meaning that more people want to become part of these trades, meaning education, the cost of acquiring a license, is going to go up. Now, it's not always purely the government's fault. People in the same trade are going to try and erect barriers to entry in order to prevent other people from entering them to keep their wages artificially high. The problem is that when they unite, they often get regulation to back them. And don't think this is a thing of the past. Today we have so much regulation that benefits so few people. And it's not just big companies like Yahoo and Disney, despite popular belief. In specific trades, it is illegal to hire somebody who isn't part of a labor union, even if that person is really, really good at their job. For his second point, Smith goes to the complete opposite extreme. Just like governments can restrict the number of people entering into a trade, so governments can also increase the amount of competition by making it easier for people to enter a trade than they naturally would. Mostly, they do this through subsidies. Smith spends the majority of time in this point talking about a case study of priests. Apparently, back in the day, governments used to subsidize priest education, so there was an overabundance of priests, and their wages artificially went down. And then, because you can't pay priests less than a living wage, they would then also subsidize their wages. The problem is that when you impose this on a number of trades, nobody, not even people who could afford it, would pay for an education in order to enter into that trade. Why the hell would you pay for law school if the government is going to pay for it for you? This means that the lovely natural cost of education that we discussed in the previous chapter would be shot all to hell. And wages for those trades would decline. In many Western European countries, university is free, and that's really well and good and wonderful, but it also means that people in those trades get paid less across the board. But another really important case study that Smith discusses is the concept of teachers. When the government didn't subsidize basic education, it was very, very expensive because it was rare and very valuable. Teachers apparently used to be paid a fortune. He says that ancient teachers like Pluto and Isocrates were obscenely wealthy. But he also claims that this severe decrease in wages is worth it for society as a whole. With some tradesmen, like teachers, the benefits reaped from the cheapness and availability of the production, i.e. education, far outweigh the detriment to their wages. It's a very interesting take and an important consideration in understanding the decline of teachers' salaries. And finally, last, and I would argue least, the government can artificially influence wages and profits by obstructing movement of commodities and labor through the market. He spends a lot of time talking about laws of gaining a settlement, and it took me several rereads to understand that he meant that literally, gain a settlement. Apparently, back in the day, in order to live or work a specific place, you had to have permission by the parishioner to live there. And if you didn't, then you could get kicked out. These laws were put in place to provide for poor people, but they had effects on the rest of the laboring population. This level of policy doesn't really exist today in the Western world. Freedom of movement and occupation is a really big deal for democratic countries. But the closest we have to a modern counterpart is probably immigration laws. Although you can move within your own country very freely and live basically anywhere you want, you cannot necessarily move to another country and do the same. A British person with a startup can't just move to Silicon Valley in order to pursue that startup. They need a working visa. The US denies working visas on a regular basis, meaning that they're actually stunting economic growth. New companies bring new jobs and new opportunities and new profits. If the people who have a really good idea and the hard work to back a good company don't get working permits, all of this economic growth is lost. Okay. That is enough for this week. If you do not want to miss the next chapter of The Rent of Land, click somewhere in this box to subscribe. If this summary was beneficial for you, give me a thumbs up, follow me on social media stuff, all the links are in the description. See ya.